Forward TV. The world is thinking.
And Brown has actually explicitly sought to distance himself from Blair's legacy. David Miliband, for example, in his recent speech to the Labour conference, spoke of the second wave of Labour foreign policy. Yet both Brown and Blair have constantly stressed Britain's role as a moral actor in the world. Miliband, for example, emphasised to Ikhlas Mohammed, the refugee from Darfur who appeared at the Labour Party conference, he said, "We won't forget you, we'll be there for you." And Brown has very much focused on issues of poverty, global inequality, Burma and Sudan. So really, if the idea of foreign policy driven by morality rather than interest remains, one of the questions to think about might be what really was the point of disagreement between Blair and his critics, and what kind of foreign policy can we expect under Brown? And really, what does it mean anyway for foreign policy to be driven by morality rather than interest? So in order to help us answer these questions and maybe even raise a few more questions, we've got three excellent speakers. So on my far left, we have Conor Foley, who's a humanitarian aid worker. He's worked for an impressive variety of human rights organisations, including Liberty, Amnesty International, also the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He's worked in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Colombia and Bosnia. On my left, we have Alex Bigham from the Foreign Policy Centre. Alex is the head of communications and projects, and he also heads up the Foreign Policy Centre's research programmes on Iran, Iraq and Pakistan. And then last but not least, on my right, we have Phil Cunliffe, who is a researcher from King's College London and also convener of the Sovereignty and Its Discontents International Relations Working Group. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panellists to start the discussion. I'll go to Conor first. Take it away, Conor.
Thanks. It's always worrying to be described as being on the extreme left of a speaker. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to the organisers of this event. The last time I was here was 7 years ago at a similar event, and I can see it's grown a lot, so congratulations. I know that's an awful lot of work. Thinking back on that time, and as Tara outlined the developments of international relations, I've been out of Britain for most of that period. In fact, I think this is the first time that I've spoken at a political event back in Britain since then. And it's interesting to think how much has changed. At that time, I was participating in a debate with John Lachlan and Geoffrey Robertson, who represented, I suppose, the quite distinct views on international relations, one firmly rooted in concepts of sovereignty and the other more firmly rooted in concepts of multilateralism. I was working at Amnesty International at the time. I'd had responsibility for the organisation's, the UK section's work on impunity during the negotiations that led up to the adoption of the International Criminal Court and with the arrest of Augusto Pinochet in London. And the arrest of the former Chilean dictator in Britain on the foot of a Spanish extradition warrant for crimes that he'd amnestied himself for committed in Chile was probably actually more than Kosovo, although they occurred on literally the same day. I think the high point of the view that human rights can trump national sovereignty in foreign policy making. A couple of months before that, Robin Cook had outlined his vision of putting human rights at the heart of Labour's foreign policy at a conference that my team organised at Amnesty International on the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think we clearly had a view then that human rights could become a guiding force alongside international law for a new world order. I was asked by the Council of Europe to go to Kosovo during the war in 1999 to run some training sessions for refugees in Albania and Macedonia, and was one of the first aid workers into Pristina at the end of the conflict in August of '99, and then returned and spent a year in Kosovo working for the UN High Commission for Refugees. After September the 11th, I went to Afghanistan and spent a year and a half there, working for two different non-governmental organisations. And over the last 4 or 5 years since then, I've been working in a variety of conflict and post-conflict zones, mainly doing international assistance, protection and human rights training work. And so coming back to Britain, it's interesting to see how there really has been quite a political transformation in the way that people regard human rights and international law. And what to me has been the most interesting thing is not that there remains a tension between the multilateralists on the one hand and the unilateralists or the sovereigntyites on the other, but how New Labour, in the personage of Tony Blair, went completely across from having a commitment to putting human rights at the heart of his foreign policy, from negotiating the statute of the International Criminal Court, incorporating the European Convention of Human Rights into domestic law, to participating in a blatantly illegal invasion of a sovereign nation, Iraq, to acquiescing in the global war on terror, which is based on a policy of state torture, from moving to a position where Labour ministers say that the Geneva Convention protecting people against torture is out of date, or that people who are opposed to 90 days detention without trial will have blood on their hands and are siding with the terrorists. It is, to me, a strange paradox how that has happened, and I was given 5 minutes to open, and I'd like to explore in the discussion why I think that's happened. I think that a section of the left around New Labour told themselves a series of lies. They told themselves some lies about what international law says, what international human rights law says, and what its relationship with the UN Charter is, particularly because they wanted to justify the invasion of Kosovo, which didn't have UN Security Council backing. They then told themselves a series of lies about what happened in Kosovo, what led up to the intervention, what happened after the intervention, and what a mess was made of administering Kosovo. As a result of those lies, they thought that it was easy to invade other countries. They thought that you could do it with air power. You could rely on proxy troops on the ground, as they'd done in Kosovo with the KLA, as they did in Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance. And they thought it was easy to administer countries in post-conflict situations, as they thought they'd done it in Kosovo, as they thought they'd done it in Afghanistan, as they thought they'd done it in Iraq. For anyone who's actually there and saw how terrible the situation was in Kosovo, the massive ethnic cleansing that took place against Kosovo's ethnic minorities while NATO troops were there, the destruction of the complete breakdown of the rule of law in Afghanistan while troops were being sent into Iraq, we could all see what was going to happen with Iraq. The first time I visited Iraq was in the early 1990s when I visited the Kurdish safe haven, and which again was justified at the time as being a success, but was a complete failure. If you'd been there, if you'd seen it, you'd have known it. We got attacked by the Turkish military, and something that quite similar to what's happening now. There was Turkish military incursions against the PKK. The idea that the West had saved the Kurds using the no-fly zone or the safe haven was again part of the ideological equipment that led up to the invasion of Iraq. It simply wasn't true. I think that, and I'm sorry to put Alex on the spot for this, but I think that is the interesting thing for me would be to find out why key policymakers on the left within the Labour Party got foreign policy, got human rights, got international law so badly wrong.
Great, thank you very much, Conor. So now we'll move on to Alex.
Well, thank you. I'll try and respond partly in my speech to some of the points you've made, Conor, and no doubt in the discussion as well. I was very pleased to be invited to speak on this topic today. I'm sorry for those of you who are expecting to see Brian Bravati. It is a particularly pertinent debate, actually, for the Foreign Policy Centre where I work. The FPC was set up in 1998, not long after Robin Cook used his famous phrase and actually talked about an ethical dimension to foreign policy. And I think that's one small caveat we should remember, which is often forgotten, that it was an ethical dimension to foreign policy, not ever striving to be a totally ethical foreign policy. I think it was a laudable ideal to strive for. Very difficult to comprehend and difficult to implement, of course, as ethics means so many things to so many different people. And I think it was fairly obvious at the time that for a country that relies on arms exports as part of our economy, as part of our kind of strategic foreign policy, for better or for worse, selling weapons to many unseemly regimes, I think, smacked of ethical hypocrisy following that phrase. To bring us to the present, I think while we're in the midst of sectarian chaos in Iraq, a bloody fight for democracy in Afghanistan, some would claim, as Conor has, that Labour's ethical foreign policy has failed. I think what we should remember, though, even though it's very hard to be totally objective about foreign policy, are the successes that we've seen since 1997. Fewer wars since 1997, fewer people living on less than $1 a day, more being treated for HIV and AIDS, debt to the poorest countries written off, things such as landmines banned, dictators such as Milosevic removed, and the EU expanded and more prosperous. However, I think many of these successes, the ethical pluses, if you like, will seem less significant, I think, if the result of the invasion of Iraq is to stymie the cause of liberal intervention for a generation. So I think when we're considering what a post-Blair ethical foreign policy might look like, I think there are three key questions for us to consider. One, is liberal intervention an ethical aim post-Iraq? Secondly, on what moral basis can we intervene in other states? And thirdly, what should the limits of our power be in the war against international terrorism? So on the first question, is liberal intervention an ethical aim post-Iraq? Clearly, Gordon Brown has sought to redefine British foreign policy on a kind of more popular tack, if you like. So while British troops are given a broad exit strategy from Iraq, his international stance is focused on the promotion of human rights, but without committing additional British troops. So the new axis of evil is not Iran, Iraq and North Korea, but Burma, Sudan and Zimbabwe. Intervention's never easy, but I think it would be one of the greatest mistakes if at the beginning of the 21st century, the lesson we learned from Iraq was that we must retreat from challenging tyrants and human rights abusers. It's foolish to think that the problems of Iraq or Afghanistan simply stem from the invasion by an external power. Yes, serious mistakes were made in the initial occupations, but those conflicts run far deeper than that, fueled by a bloodthirsty ideology, ethnic tensions that were brutally suppressed by the use of a police state, and naked hunger for the riches of the state, often masquerading as ethnic identifications. We should, of course, remember the successful interventions, the Kosovan refugees protected, Sierra Leone's democratic government maintained, and, of course, the cruel barbarism of the Taliban removed. I think there's a dangerous parallel from history. In the aftermath of the conflict in Vietnam, a costly, bloody war that damaged America's international standing, the US retreated from making many tough foreign policy choices. When Jimmy Carter became president, he sought to make human rights his guiding principle, but with it he emphasized a kind of ideological relativism that had no clarity of purpose. In 1977, he said, "This does not mean that we can conduct our foreign policy by rigid moral maxims. We live in a world that is imperfect and which will always be imperfect, a world that is complex and confused and which will always be complex and confused." So as Dennis McShane has said, the danger is to avoid this Jimmy Carterization of foreign policy, of trying to replace hard choices with soft, fuzzy, warm words about human rights and development. Britain's allies, our partners, opponents, our enemies, and yes, we do have enemies, need certainty. Carter offered waffle and goodwill. Military intervention is not the sine qua non of humanitarian action, but the question for governments is not just looking at the range of alternative options available, but making again the case for liberal intervention to a sceptical public. The second question is, on what moral basis can we intervene in other states? And I think far more work needs to be done in this area. Tony Blair actually set out some broad thinking in his Chicago speech in 1999. His suggestions, I think, are a basis for further debate. First, are we sure of our case? War is an imperfect instrument for righting humanitarian distress, but armed force is sometimes the only means of dealing with dictators. Second, have we exhausted all diplomatic options? We should always give peace every chance. Third, on the basis of a practical assessment of the situation, are there military operations we can sensibly and prudently undertake? Fourth, are we prepared for the long term? In the past, we talked too much of exit strategies, but having made a commitment, we cannot simply walk away once the fight is over. And finally, do we have national interests involved? The mass expulsion of ethnic Albanians from Kosovo demanded the notice of the rest of the world. But it does make a difference.
We'll certainly come back.
We can bring up this point. but the point he was making was this taking place on our doorstep. The third question I raised was, what should the limits on our power be in the war against international terrorism? And I think this is possibly the most controversial issue. International terrorism, whether it's in Helmand, London, Bali, or most recently in Pakistan, is yet another example of what I'd call foreign policy on our doorstep. We're faced not just with questions about the ethical approach of our diplomats or our armed forces, but most consider areas traditionally associated with domestic politics, so policing, civil liberties, and community engagement. In the Second World War, our freedoms were curtailed because we understood that the enemy we faced was serious enough not just to threaten our country, but our way of life. In peacetime, many of those restrictions were relaxed. In the 21st century, it doesn't seem possible to distinguish between peacetime and wartime. We're living through a paradox, a constant state of emergency. And I think it's right that we ask the question whether we amend our civil liberties to reflect that kind of emergency situation. The most controversial aspect, as Conor raised, has to be torture. We're all aware of the extremely serious accusations against our own government and the US government concerning the use of torture. But instead of facing up to this, it seems, and asking the ethical questions, it seems in some ways we're conniving with the politicians to brush the issue under the carpet. Torture is held up in lights as a unique human right, the only one that's non-divisible. There is no apparent context in which torture is acceptable, unlike, for example, the right to liberty, the right to life. Here is our ethical question. I think at least if you accept, and I appreciate some people may disagree with this, a utilitarian version of ethics, of the greatest good to the greatest number. I think if you asked the public straight up if they thought it was right to torture someone, clearly they would say no. But if you asked if it's possible to justify torturing a terrorist or suspected terrorist in order to gain information that could potentially save hundreds of lives, then I think you'd get a very different answer. There might even be a reasonable majority in favour if you said specifically that torture was limited to such practices as waterboarding, sleep deprivation, interrogation, standing people in stress positions, and similar methods that are no doubt used by governments across the world, including the United States. Torture happens. It's an unfortunate fact of the modern world, and it's not always the evil regimes which are doing it. And I should stress I'm not justifying torture. I do think we need to have a serious ethical discussion about what the implications of this practice are. So those are my thoughts and some of my responses to Conor's point. I'll be very interested to hear yours.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. That was great. Now over to Phil.
Thanks, Tara. As time is short, I'll get straight to the point. And what I would like to do is to think more about to question the claims made for ethical foreign policies. So the two claims usually made for ethical foreign policies are that they're progressive and universalistic. Progressive because they're concerned with alleviating the plight of the vulnerable, the victims of globalization, the weak and the marginal, and universalistic because they push us beyond our kind of national egotism to a common concern with suffering humanity wherever and whoever they may be. Now, by contrast, I don't think ethical foreign policies are either progressive or universalistic. On the contrary, I think this kind of the use of ethics as a guide for political action is deeply undemocratic and deeply conservative as well. I've got three specific problems with the ideas underpinning ethics in foreign policy and ethics in kind of political action. And the first one is this anti-democratic problem, I think. If we think about, what does it mean when people kind of bandy ethics around, as I think Alex mentioned just now, there's this very kind of vague idea, and yet, there's this constant talk about values, and these are our values, and this is the ethics that we stand for. We need to be moral actors. And I think that when political leaders in particular invoke this kind of language, they're suggesting that there's some kind of basic fundamental values around which there's already a consensus. They're saying, these values that we talk about are so fundamental, they're so basic and foundational that everybody already agrees about them, really. So what that effectively means, though, is you don't actually have to go through a political process, a process of political debate, to win people over to those values in the first place. Because they're so kind of fundamental, there's no need to try and argue for them. Rather, they're just kind of asserted as this automatic consensus. And so in that sense, I think it's deeply hostile to the very principle of democracy. No effort is made to relate these values, these kind of great aspirational values that we should be driving forward in the world, to ordinary people's everyday concerns and interests. The second problem is its conservatism, I think. Precisely because these values are taken to be already there, they're assumed to be kind of already in existence, and everybody basically agrees on them, then it exonerates our political leaders of having to, of any kind of need for any creative task. They have no need to build a vision. All they have to do is act effectively as the self-appointed guardians of policing this consensus that already exists. And this is even revealed in the kind of diplomatic language that's used. It's always talking about interventions to uphold and defend our values. So this kind of, there's this deeply defensive, reactive posture, which means that there's no need to actually build anything progressive. It's simply kind of defending a status quo that has never actually been justified in the first place. And I mean, the other thing that's so striking about it is everybody can tell you, the ethics are defined negatively. Everybody can tell you what's wrong, but nobody actually ever tells you what's right. So these ethics are always defined in opposition to the most kind of, transparent and obvious evil, like totalitarianism, genocide, humanitarian crisis. But there's never really any positive vision pushed forward. And then third is the problem of universalism, that there's this claim to be kind of concerned with everyone. But I think if you peer behind the kind of the ethical rhetoric, the idea of universalism in this ethical foreign policy is actually very shallow, if not just completely empty. Because always underlying it, there's actually a hierarchy, and that's a hierarchy between the virtuous rescuer and the benighted victim. And the virtuous rescuer is always the one who's privileged. These kinds of ethical concern and this kind of parading of altruism is essentially, there's a deep narcissism underlying it, I think. And, it's always the virtuous rescuer who has all the kind of action, all the right to all the legitimacy, all the power to move, while it's the victim only ever has any claim on our sympathy as long as they remain passive and, kind of benighted and stricken. And so underneath the kind of claim to be completely equal, concerned with everyone equally, there's a very kind of clear distinction between the rescuer and the victim. And so for that reason, I think, there is no real kind of universalism underpinning these ethical values. So those are my three concerns: the kind of hostility to democracy, the profound kind of conservatism underlying this idea of ethics and political action, and this hollow idea of universalism underpinning it.
Okay, thank you very much. So before I open it out to the floor, I just want to maybe ask the speakers a question or two, or see if they particularly want to come back at anything that has been said, and then we'll open it out to you. Just quickly to Conor and Alex, I wonder, initially it seemed that you very much disagreed with each other, but I wonder if there is so much point of disagree, or what exactly is your disagreement? Conor, you seem to suggest there was a strong break, or sort of a serious break between the kind of early humanitarian intervention and later intervention maybe in Iraq. And I wonder if, just to draw you out a little bit on that, what you see exactly is the difference so much in those two. And also if you'd both maybe, what do you think about, say, Phil's critique that there is a sort of fundamentally unprogressive aspect to ethical foreign policy? And Phil, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, are you saying that foreign policy can never be moral? What exactly are you critiquing, particularly ethical foreign policy as we have seen it? Or are you suggesting that foreign policy can never have a moral basis? I mean, what can underlie foreign policy? So just if you, everyone come back quickly, and then we'll throw it out. I'm sure the audience have a lot of questions they want to... I don't know, Conor, do you want to come back?
Well, I think Alex illustrated some of the problems, which is quite simply, if politicians stand up and lie about the basis for an intervention and people believe it, and then people restate that lie, then there is a credibility factor in supporting foreign policy if it's continually based on lies. What Alex said about Kosovo is simply not true, and he must know it, because anyone who's ever been in Kosovo knows that's not what happened. Secondly, how can a government claiming to support having human rights at the heart of its foreign policy have anything other than unequivocal opposition to the use of torture? The question of torture is quite simple. Are you prepared to be tortured? Are you prepared to be tortured by a government because you might know something? It's not, do you think it should be done to anyone else? Should it be done to you? I've been held under anti-terrorist legislation, accused of participating in terrorism. In fact, someone I bumped into this morning organised a picket outside Paddington Green Police Station for me 20 years ago. It's scary. I know what sleep deprivation is like. I know what food deprivation is like. I know what it's like to be threatened. I know what it's like to get mild physical abuse. I've never experienced waterboarding, but I've spoken to lots of people who have. If you're prepared to see it inflicted on yourself, then we can talk about it. But frankly, appealing to the fact that a large number of people are racist, therefore racism is an acceptable thing, this is actually beyond the bounds of, I would see, a civilised debate. So I don't think there is much points of reference that we have between us. On the point of universalism and moralism, I think there is probably, I mean, I said in my introduction, a broad philosophical distinction between two types of people. One who would see we live in a global world of nation states, but of increasing globalizing economy and communication. We need global rules to deal with that. Therefore, we create global institutions. We create a global system of international law. And we abide by it because it's in our common interest to have that sort of system. So for all the criticisms that I would make of the United Nations, of the European Union, of the World Bank, of the World Trade Organization, of the European Council of Human Rights, I think that they are fundamentally good things. It's better to have them than not. I think that governments should abide by the law than not. There might be a case, I can see a theoretical case made for breaking the law for a greater moral necessity. But the problem is, who will define that? How will that case be made? How can we be clear when a government says it's doing something that it isn't lying? Because unfortunately governments do lie. So I would, other things being equal, prefer to see us abiding by an internationally agreed legal system and we do have some fairly clear idea about what those laws are, what they say, why, for example, torture is completely fundamentally outlawed in all circumstances. My preference would be to stay on the right side of the law. Yeah, that's enough.
Okay, great, thank you. Conor, Alex, if you...
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some degree of consensus between us. If only, and you might deny this, but if only in the basis and an agreement on a fundamental principle about human rights.
Yeah, torture's wrong.
Well, you made the point about torture. I wasn't suggesting, as I said in my speech, that torture was correct. What I was suggesting is that large numbers of the public are acquiescing in this process because they've actually, not just because they're ignoring it, they think it doesn't happen, because they've actually made an ethical judgment that if you torture a suspected terrorist and the result of that is you get intelligence which will save a far greater number of lives, that you can make a kind of utilitarian judgment about human rights, and it's better to save the larger number of lives at the same time as you take away someone's, and I agree it is a fundamental human right. I mean, I don't understand your point on Kosovo. I mean, specifically, what were you suggesting that I'd lied about when you came to Kosovo?
Well, the refugee crisis took place after NATO's intervention, so you can't cite the refugee crisis before NATO's intervention as justification for it. It was a direct response to the bombing.
Well, it wasn't a direct response to the bombing. I think what you're saying is that the number of refugees increased after the NATO bombing because Milosevic was trying to speed up the process because perhaps he knew his days were numbered. Mm. Now, in the long term, what was the long-term result of Kosovo? It was actually that a large number of ethnic Kosovans could return to their homeland. Milosevic was removed. He was actually put up in The Hague in an international court of justice, the kind of legal process that you've been talking about. I mean, I think there's a difficult question when it comes to, we simply say human rights are about the institutions and the rules in international law. There's clearly not an effective consensus on international law. We saw that over Iraq. You know, we can't simply say that because we didn't find weapons of mass destruction that Saddam shouldn't have been removed from power. Saddam was a brutal dictator. If you say that you value human rights, surely it matters that Iraqis were being abused by Saddam and the only way to remove him from power was through military force. I mean, Saddam would still be in power today if it wasn't for the war in Iraq.
Okay, is that it? I'll just take Phil to come back, and then we'll open up to the floor. So Phil, if you want to come back.
Yeah, I mean, on Kosovo, the thing that, I agree with Conor about the way the kind of conflict actually played out, but the thing that also strikes me about Kosovo is that the Albanian population were fighting, claimed they were fighting for their independence, and they're still kind of arguing for independence now. So supposedly Labour and Tony Blair and NATO and so on went to war to defend the Kosovars, but they only kind of wanted to defend them as victims. The minute the Albanians began asserting themselves and saying, hey, wait a minute, what we actually want is independence. We want to be kind of masters of our own destiny, not just kind of cute telegenic victims, then suddenly they become the problem. So I mean, the way in which the conflict was moralized from the very beginning was not only, did it kind of violate the sovereignty of Serbia, and was the first, the legal war before Iraq, the illegal Iraq war. It was also a case where, the people in it were completely kind of treated as objects who had no role to play in the situation at all. So, I think that's the other kind of important thing to remember about Kosovo. The Albanians want independence, while it's discussed in terms of just kind of treating them as victims. The second thing that strikes me, kind of listening to the way the debate's gone on the panel. Originally, the idea of ethics in war was the idea of restraining war. It was about, the Geneva Convention. It was about states go to war, and then you have to, kind of try and regulate war. And when you capture somebody, you don't torture them, you don't shoot them. They're a prisoner of war, they fall under legal regulation. Well, now it seems to be ethics has become the justification for war. We need to match certain kind of ethical criteria in order to go to war, and that seems to me a very dangerous kind of flip over. And it also, and this relates to torture, suddenly, kind of in this climate where there's this discussion of everybody seems to be talking about values, is precisely the moment when people begin talking about legalizing torture. And I agree with Conor, it's the basic kind of question is not like this kind of hypothetical utilitarian scenarios about what would happen, if there was a ticking bomb scenario, how would you respond? It's whether you want to give the state that power to torture you. I think that's the basic question as regards torture and rights vis-a-vis the state.
Okay, great. Thank you, Phil. So what I'm going to do is take 3 questions at once. We've got 2 people who will be coming around with the microphone. So I'll take 3. The panelists will respond briefly, and then I'll come out again. So lots of questions. So I'll just start at the back. There's a gentleman in a jacket.
Sounds obvious.
Yes, we use the mic.
I mean, like from a Trotsky stick.
A microphone then. I have a bit of a problem with with 2 things that each one of you said in the panel. In the white shirt, sir, you said that we live in a constant state of emergency. You said that we have to live in a constant state of emergency. If I don't think I live in a constant state of emergency, am I somehow in self-denial? That ties in with you, sir, on the left, where you said that you derided the promotion of values, right? Now, I think that I think we undervalue our values, and I think the problem is that we're not proud enough of our values. There's a session upstairs and say, upstairs, why are we so anti-American? Because we seem to have lost confidence in our democratic, the struggles, the freedoms that we've had in the West to get where we are. And I think that if we don't have a sense of our own values, then we risk to lose confidence. And the more we lose confidence, the more we fall prey to thinking that we must live in a constant state of emergency.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just take 2 more questions. I'll just take a couple at the back, and then I will come forward. Don't worry. Gentleman right at the back with grey hair, and then the lady here with brown hair and orange thingy.
All right. 2 points I wanted to make about ethical foreign policy and primarily the ethics of intervention, because I think that's primarily what we're talking about here. A lot of the debate is about the right to intervene, and I think as Phil said at the end, part of the history behind the emergence of rights to self-defense and so on are constraints on going to war. They weren't, in a sense, an encouragement to do it. And I think it's interesting that what we don't do when we talk about a right to intervene is we don't talk about the corollary of a positive duty to intervene, because no country wants a positive duty to have to intervene in all cases where things aren't bad. And that's what undermines, in a sense, the public's view about this talk about ethics. Okay, it's the discretionary liberty to intervene when you feel like it in the cases that you think are useful and important. If there was a real right to intervene, a positive right, with a positive claim right to intervene with a duty that's a corollary of that we must intervene in all cases, we would certainly not have many people, Blair or otherwise, arguing for a right to intervene. It would be far too burdensome, and it would expose some of the important costs that intervention and war bring with it. The other quick point, I mean, we often talk about getting rid of Saddam Hussein, and that's wonderful, and I have no problem. I have nothing to say in Saddam Hussein's favour. But in all cases, well, we make that kind of argument. It's a naive politics. The idea that somehow or other there is one individual, or two or three, maybe his sons around him, who can sustain a wicked regime is just naive politics. In all the cases that we've talked about, in Kosovo, in Serbia, in all of these cases, the politics that sustains these kinds of regimes is enormously complex, and that's why when you decapitate them, you have the kind of situation you have in Iraq at the moment. It just isn't the case that there were two or three nasty people hurting others, and that's all we had to deal with. It's never like that, and I think therefore we have to get our politics right as well if we're going to start talking about an ethical foreign policy.
Thank you very much. And finally, the lady with the curly brown hair. There you go. If you could just, and if I could ask everyone to keep their question statements brief.
Yes, Kerry Dingle, World Right. Conor, quick thing. You talked about the left lying to themselves vis-à-vis international law, but I'm wondering, given what we've heard from Alex and his paranoid state of emergency and support for intervention, can international law actually protect us from the anti-democratic, anti-human views that Alex espouses? Sorry, Alex, but there you go. And Alex, you've talked about, the only thing I could agree with what you've said is the failure of political leadership in terms of intervention. At least people who are pro-intervention stand up for something, and our leaders constantly fail to win the argument, and hence are wholly anti-democratic and quite anti-political in their mode of operation. But given that's the case, why do you believe that it's possible to export democracy anywhere else? Which I think is the antithesis of democracy anyway. And third thing, very quickly, I'd like to know what all the panel think about intervening in Darfur, as that's now the ethical, justification.
OK, thank you very much, Kerry. So I'll ask our panellists to come back briefly, and then we'll take another round of questions. So shall we get Phil? Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, on the question of values and the promotion of values, I think the thing about, it's not that you can't have values in politics or that you can't kind of act without values. I think it's the nature of these values that they're, when people talk about ethics, they're not talking about something that they're willing to kind of win people over to. In that sense, it's not really a set of it's not a political set of principles. So it's very, like the kind of, Tony Blair was very clear about what his values were, but he wasn't really, he wasn't kind of willing to hold those up to any kind of democratic process. So when he kind of looks in the television imploringly into your eyes and tells you, I did what I thought was right, he's not kind of thinking in terms of values that would apply to everyone. He's talking about the little voice that speaks inside him to him alone. And that's the way foreign policy should be organized, around that little voice. And that, so I mean, if those are the kind of values you're talking about, then, you can keep them. But if you want to have values that you can have a political kind of process around, political values for how we organize society, how we organize common life, how we organize, how we want to live in the future, then that's a very different kind of thing. So I think these kind of, when people say ethics and values, what they mean is, we already agree about all this, so we don't really need to talk about it. And that's the thing that I think is very pernicious and ends up with a situation that we have when Tony Blair can kind of put the world to fire and sword in order to listen to the higher calling that he's kind of hears alone.
OK, great, thank you. Alex, do you want to respond? Then we'll go to Conor.
Yeah, there were quite a lot of points made to me. On the gentleman in the back, your question about the constant state of emergency, I think you've hit on something. If it is about the individual in a sense, and if you're not prepared to live in a constant state of emergency, clearly you won't. And as I said, it is a paradox between this idea of a constant and a sense of emergency, which, in theory at least, should be something that's temporary. I was amazed to give one example, talking to someone at the Home Office, that one of the reasons behind the idea of having a 24-hour drinking culture, if you like, or ability to be able to drink round the clock, was the idea that more people would be out on the streets, at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And one of the ideas was we become a more vigilant culture. And it is extraordinary. I'm not saying I agree with this, but and that therefore, if we were more vigilant, we would effectively become kind of human kind of CCTV cameras and be able to spot people putting bombs onto tubes in the middle of the night, which of course presumably they don't do as no one will be on there. But
especially after 5 pints.
And yes, the idea that you would be particularly vigilant at that time, as you fall asleep on the night bus is extraordinary. But there is this real sense, I think, and it's something we need to think about, this constant state of emergency. On the right to intervene, yes, I agree with Philip's point and the point made by the person about that the original justification for these things was as a constraint to war. But the question is, does the Geneva Convention, do the original founding ideas behind this really still apply when we're talking about an organisation such as Al-Qaeda? When these rules and regulations of international law were drawn up, we had a style of warfare that was considered to be, honourable, and it was, soldiers killing other soldiers, and there was a code of honour there. But when you're trying to...
No interventions, please, from the floor.
When you're trying to fight an enemy which judges itself on the number of civilians it kills, not by the number of civilians it doesn't kill, then I think there's a very serious question as to whether those rules and regulations really work. On the point on Darfur, yes, I do agree we should intervene.
Okay, great. Then Conor, finally.
Two excellent points. I said the left lied to itself about international law. I think Alex has just demonstrated the left doesn't really understand international law at all, or human rights. I think the left has always had a problem with human rights because human rights is essentially a liberal ideology, or is based on individualism and the rights of individuals, whereas the left, even in the new Labour take of the left, is more of a collectivist organisation, is suspicious of individual rights, and always has been. There is an authoritarianism in the left that comes out again and again. It's difficult to know because Alex started talking about the constraints about going to war, which are contained in the UN Charter, which is quite right, and then started talking about the Geneva Convention and its protections against torture, which is a completely different subject. We could talk about one or we could talk about the other. I think it would be helpful if the left could do some thinking of itself on this. The way in which the Attorney General was leaned on to state, to give an opinion which clearly undermined his dignity of office, led to resignations from the Foreign Office, made him look a fool in the eyes of the world. The invasion of Iraq clearly was illegal. That doesn't mean that you have to support Saddam Hussein. It's just clearly saying that there was a whole number of reasons why people who opposed the invasion of Iraq felt it was the wrong thing to do. One of them was that it would undermine international law. Another was it would give an encouragement to Islamic jihadis. Another was that it would make things worse for the ordinary people of Iraq. Another thing was it might lead to the breakup of the state into sectarian fiefdoms. These were our concerns. They're being borne out. The international law argument, I think, I don't want to give an international seminar on the question. I'm writing a book on it, so I could spend longer on it. But I think it is important to just try to get some of the things depackaged. War is a bad thing. War should not be justified. War should not happen. There are two circumstances in which war is justified under international law. One of them is self-defense, when a country gets attacked, and that could be, as happened with the World Trade Center, when the US and UK governments actually did send a letter to the UN under Article 51 saying we are responding to an armed attack, and NATO also made the same point. That's one legal intervention. We can agree or disagree with how the intervention was done, but it was within the orbit of international law. Another is when the UN Security Council authorises armed intervention. The UN Security Council has used its Chapter 7 powers to authorise a number of interventions, and case by case, I'm quite happy to think we should think about when intervention is going to be justified. Bosnia, Rwanda, Liberia, large parts of West Africa, the DRC. There currently is a Chapter 7 resolution authorising intervention in Darfur. It was, in fact, a success, I think, of Gordon Brown's different style, that he stopped the rhetoric about bombing the Sudanese Air Force, which Tony Blair had been going on about for the previous year without doing anything, and actually worked to get the Chinese government, the Sudanese government, on side for a negotiated intervention. There frankly is not the basis for thinking there will be a non-consensual intervention in Darfur. The West is not going to invade Darfur. People who give a contrary impression are only giving some false solace to the Darfuri rebel groups who are this weekend refusing to attend the peace talks. They need to be told it's not an option. They have to talk about peace. The West is not going to come to their rescue. It's purely a delusion to think that. And large numbers of people have died because of it. People who say that they support humanitarians, say they support human rights, and then consistently ignore what's been told to them in the field. Every single aid organisation is saying exactly the same thing. Stop talking about armed intervention. Start talking about getting people to the peace talks. Sudan is now on a knife edge because the civil war, which racked it for 50-odd years, could erupt again in the south. That's the problem. And it's a far, far bigger problem than Darfur. Really, irresponsible talk about intervention is making things dramatically worse for people.
Okay, thank you very much, Conor. Okay, so I'm going to take 3 more questions. So I would ask you to be brief so that we can maybe even take another round. So I'm just going to sort of start at the front and kind of... I'll take this gentleman in the beige jacket here.
I think some of Alex's arguments in his first statement seemed quite plausible until he starts talking about wars against international terrorism. I mean, the war against terror as a concept, and international terrorism is the same thing, is just totally a discredited concept. And then he talks about torturing a terrorist. I mean, can we have a definition of who our enemy is other than by the means by which that enemy fights? And Palestinians are, come obviously to mind, and all sorts of other people around the world. And it seems to me the ultimately immoral act is to define your enemy in such a loose way that it gives you the license to go whenever and wherever you want, without any real identification of who the enemy is and why you're fighting against them.
Okay, thank you very much. And this gentleman here in the blue jacket.
Thank you. Can we go back to basics? In your booklet, the round copy here, it says, will Brown be able to restore the moral authority of British foreign policy? The supposition here is there was some sort of golden age when Britain had any sort of moral authority worth talking about. And I haven't got time to... I don't just talk in generalizations or go through a great catalogue of things, but if we just take one thing as an example, a terrifying, terrible thing, if you look at the record on Indonesia, this is about complicity in genocide. 1 million people were slaughtered between 65 and 98, 33 years, long time. Suharto, supported by Britain and America and Australia for 30-odd years. Invasion of East Timor killed 1/3 of the population. We supplied arms and support to Suharto. Denny Seeley, Michael Stewart, David...
So I don't want to cut you off, but do try and make your point, please, so we can take more questions.
Well, my point is that we aren't restoring any sort of moral authority because we didn't have it in the first place. And it's not just about intervention, as somebody was saying. It's about arms sales, it's about support for unethical, powerful governments, and lots of other things.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think just behind the gentleman in a grey jacket there, if you want to... Great, thank you.
Is it working? Yep. My question was just for Conor, which was, you talked about the left not understanding international law. my point that I'd put to you was that you seem maybe perhaps deluded by it, in the sense that, and this is, it's interesting given your sort of background and your experience and what you've been doing over the last few years. Something that strikes me about the way the situation is at the moment on the question of humanitarian intervention, using military power for human rights causes, it seems to be that at the moment, quite a few human rights organizations themselves are now coming to the realization that, or they're now starting to, if you like, reap the consequences of their earlier invocations for humanitarian intervention to take place. Because inevitably what happens is the only ones who can intervene are the powerful states. And then you have all the consequences that follow from that, all the sort of discretionary elements that the gentleman over there mentioned. So you get to the situation today where, for example, the Americans want to call what's going on in Darfur a genocide, and you have human rights organizations saying, no, we don't need to use that term because we know what you're going to do with it. Now,
and because it isn't.
Amongst other reasons, but their objection to it is whether or not it is one thing, but it's because they don't like the way in which great powers manipulate what they saw as their own territory. And my point to you is that not inevitable? How do you square the circle of invoking these general principles, which when they're actualized, when they're actually put in practice, it's inevitably going to give the results that we've had up until now?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask our panelists to come back. We might have time for a brief round of other questions. Conor, if you want to, if you could make your responses brief.
Very brief. Yeah, very good point. And on the point on foreign policy, I think there is a difference. I think that Robin Cook could stand up and credibly say we're going to have an ethical dimension to our foreign policy and announce a package of measures at the end of the 1990s, and people would not just have fell about laughing, whereas frankly if Margaret Beckett had done it, people would have. So I think there was a difference, and I think what the package of measures they brought in, tightening up the rules about arms transfers, incorporation of European conventions, support for the International Criminal Court, these turning DFID into its own department. These were important gains. And on Indonesia, I spent a couple of months in Aceh. Indonesia is now a democracy and negotiated an end to the long-running civil war with the GAM in Aceh. So I think, yes, when I was at Amnesty, we did oppose arms sales to Indonesia, but we didn't oppose arms sales in all circumstances. We opposed them where they could be shown to lead to human rights violations. I think that's a tension that remains.
No interventions from the floor, please.
No, certainly it was. I'm just saying there was a period at the end of the 1990s, the early 2000s, where that point could have been credibly made, whereas by the end of Blair's days, it clearly couldn't. On the point on international law, it's true. Human rights organisations do base themselves mainly on international human rights and humanitarian law. It's our mandate. And it's useful. I mean, perhaps you're right that working for UN organisations as well, you get a little bit fixated about your mandate because it's what you can say and what you can't say, what you can do and what you can't do. I wouldn't privilege international law over doing the right thing. There might be, just as there's a case for civil disobedience in national terms, there might be a case for breaking the law to do something that's more morally correct internationally. But generally speaking, I think it's better for states to stay within the law. And the law is fairly clear what it says and what it doesn't say. On Darfur, I never particularly object if someone wants to say, Maureen Lipman, for example, wants to say Darfur's a genocide, we should do something. I mean, lots of people have been killed in Darfur, lots of terrible things have happened. The question about what to do about it is what can be done about it, and that's not actually based on whether or not it is or is not a genocide. There could be a UN Security Council intervention with or without that. And the stuff about the Genocide Convention permitting intervention outside UN Security Council operation just isn't true. I mean, people say it, but it's clearly not true. Just read the convention and it's obvious that's not the case. So maybe if I make the case a little bit too often, perhaps you read Comment is Free in The Guardian, if I make the case often, just as a corrective, I don't think it's not a shibboleth to me. I mean, it's just a simple set of rules that it's quite easy to understand and can be a useful guide to understanding state action and inaction.
Okay, thank you very much, Conor. Alex, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested to see that conceded the point on international law that it wasn't such a shibboleth, and I agree with you. I think the other difficult question for us is the institutions that uphold international law. And if we're going to say that the United Nations is the only institution, and you know, in many ways, yes, it's the best that we've got. But the question is whether some of the founding principles of that are based on the Second World War settlement, if the founding members of that and the key power brokers within that organisation are based on the Second World War. There is a real question about whether that still has the moral authority and organisation that doesn't involve India, doesn't involve Brazil, doesn't involve Germany, South Africa. You could go on and on. And also, I think, isn't fundamentally based on a democratic principle. It doesn't seek to, you know, you have ridiculous examples of, you know, dictators chairing human rights commissions and so on. I think the first question that was asked is an interesting one about the question of what's the definition of our enemy. I mean, I think the enemy defined themselves. I don't think we defined the enemy. I agree that the phrase, the war on terror, has been discredited, and that's why I used the war on international terrorism. You could have said, for instance, the enemy isn't just defined by what it does, although it is important to remember that their modus operandi is killing civilians. It's also defined by its aims, the desire to establish a medieval caliphate which would force everyone to take part in a theocratic style of government, I think is another example of that. And, you know, we have plenty of evidence to see what this enemy is.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Sorry to pressure everyone. And Phil.
I just want to come back briefly to this torture and state of emergency, and I want to call Alex out, I think, and also to answer something about this international law thing. It was, I mean, it's, you know, when there were points raised from the floor about the state of emergency, you know, like Alex conceded, oh, well, you know, maybe there really isn't a state of emergency. And then in this debate about torture, I think it's revealing, like, it was raised as a, well, we need to have a debate about this because people out there believe we should do it, but I don't really believe we should do it, but we need to have a debate about it. And I think that's a deeply kind of pernicious way to raise an issue. You know, here are people, if you want to make the case for torture, argue for torture. You know, they're not just out there. There are people here. You can make, this is a battle of ideas. So if you want to make the case for torture, make it. Rather than raising it kind of as an issue we need to think about, I think is in one way even worse, because it makes it seem like it's something acceptable that we need to consider about and reflect about, and actually makes it, you know, kind of part of our thinking, when in fact we should be very clear. Either we should have it or we shouldn't. It shouldn't be something which we should kind of raise in this haphazard kind of semi, you know, well, maybe we should think about it. You know, if you want to make the case for it, make it or don't. And I think that's the kind of the best response to this idea of trying to smuggle it in. And in terms of international law, I think it's, you know, I think international law has been equally coercive across the you know, from the early 1990s onwards. The idea that it would be legitimate if the UN Security Council passed a resolution to invade Iraq, this, you know, completely kind of undemocratic, flawed institution, that if it started kind of writing legal writs for invading countries, that would make it somehow better, I think is also wrong. In many ways, I think law functions in a similar way to ethics. It's treated as something which is already there, you know, a body of law. These institutions work, therefore we don't need to make an argument about it. Everybody agrees about these things, and therefore we just need to follow, you know, what the law says, which in this case is, in the case of international law, can be literally kind of written by the UN Security Council. So I don't think our salvation lies in law at all. I think rather it lies in actually be willing to put forward political principles and fight for them, and also the idea of that international law and international relations should be structured around principles of freedom, autonomy, and self-determination.
Okay, so I'm very sorry we've run out of time, so my apologies for everyone who hasn't asked a question. Before I ask us to thank our speakers, I just want to say that the international relations and development themes continue this afternoon. We have a discussion on China, immigration, and the EU, and Conor will be speaking tomorrow at a panel on Africa in the morning. So please join me in thanking our speakers for a great debate.